time, and which also then requires good governance plans and also good documentation of how the data came to be from the raw form all the way up into the research databases that you work with. So when do we ask these questions? There is pre-licensure when you're trying to do clinical trials. You can use real-world evidence and real data to inform the trial design, to characterize the patients, the course of disease, and also facilitate patient recruitment. Post-licensure, you can also use real-world evidence and real-world data to try and answer all of those branching questions across the changing clinical landscape with the expanding types of questions you want to ask about use of the medications, as well as the expanding populations in which these medications are being used. So recognizing how important and integral real-world evidence can be throughout the drug life cycle, there's been increasing interest from regulatory, HTA, and other stakeholders. And over the last 5 to 7 years, there's been over 50 guidance documents around the world that have been put forth. There's so many guidance documents that in the gray literature that it can be hard to track and figure out which ones to follow. But recently, the ICH, which is the International Council of Harmonization, it's a nonprofit group started in the 1990s. The founding members were the EMA, the US FDA, and the Japanese PMDA, but now there's more regulatory organizations around the world that have joined. So they come together and create international guidances, and part of the power of ICH is that they have the commitment of the member organizations to follow through on the guidance that they put out. And so recently, there's only been about a dozen guidances released in the past 30 years, but recently in May of this year, they put out ICH, the M14 guidance, which is really focused on principles for planning and designing pharmacoepi studies that use real-world data. And so what they say in this guidance is that the document is designed to streamline the development and regulatory assessment of real-world evidence study protocols. And the goal is to improve the ability of the study protocol and results to be accepted across health authorities and support decision-making. So a couple of the things that they really focus on in this guidance document is this triad of question, data, and design. So first, being really clear about articulating what is the study question, what is the question that you're trying to address. And that question has to be aligned with the issue that the end user is trying to address. And to try and articulate that question clearly, there's a couple of things you can do, like create a target trial emulation table, use the estimand framework or the PICO framework, population intervention comparator outcome and time horizon. Those are really good starting points to try and articulate that question clearly. The second thing is to consider the fitness of the data, because the data has to be appropriate to address the question of interest. And so here, including feasibility and data quality checks, making sure you are able to measure those key study parameters is recommended as part of developing that protocol. And the third is to very transparently operationalize the design and analysis parameters to make sure that you are using design and methods that's appropriate for addressing the question of interest using the proposed data source. And here you also need to consider, the usual sources of potential bias like confounding, measurement, and selection bias. But it's really only when all three are in alignment, when you have the question, the data, and design all fit for purpose, that the evidence can be considered fit for decision making. Now, there's other things in this guidance, including recommending early engagement with regulators, and then there's a lot of detail about what should go in a protocol that is submitted for regulatory consideration, and there's a whole long list of things that they are looking for, and also consider pre-registering a fully specified protocol. But what they say in this ICH document is that in the absence of specific formatting that's required by a specific regulator, to consider using the Harper protocol template, which was developed by two international societies, ISPI and ISPOR. And it's a harmonized protocol template to try and enhance transparency and reproducibility. It also includes all of the things that they ask for in regulatory submissions. So for my last slide, I just want to emphasize that in terms of using this whole ecosystem to develop clinical pathways, it really takes a village. You need a lot of people with a lot of different multidisciplinary backgrounds. You need subject matter expertise, clinical expertise, people who are experienced in applying principled methods for study design, statistical, and data mining. And you can't do it without good data. So the better the research infrastructure and linkages of data, the better you'll be able to do. Obviously, you need collaborative teams with all of these different background and experiences to enable you to carefully interpret the results and make the best decisions that you can with the information that you have. And that is all I prepared. So happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for this quite important overview on all the several perspectives in which, and the pitfalls, at least a reference to those. And that's what I would like to, if you'd like, ask first, which is if you have advice for someone who is trying to better understand the clinical pathways in their own context, with their own specificities of where we are, what kind of advice would you know for them to ask? What question to figure out what kind of questions and how to ask those questions? Yeah, okay, thanks. Sorry.
So I would say actually that the Harper protocol template might be helpful as a starting point to think about articulating the study question and really going through checking your data feasibility and is the data appropriate for addressing this particular question, and sort of walking through thinking all of those steps. It might be a good way to frame your thinking in the beginning, and then as you develop the protocol and put in more detail, then it can be used sort of to document everything that you're doing and be really transparent and make sure your work is reproducible as well, and just sort of carry that throughout the life cycle of the study.
Yeah. So another thing that I found very important is the reference to pre-registering protocols. And I feel that in RWE, we don't feel that that is such a mandatory step as we do with RCTs. And we have this discussion a lot because I feel that this would, of course, be as important, if not more important in this kind of methodologies, because the degrees of how the questions may be posed, as you very well explained, give, of course, many ways where this could go wrong in biasing the results that actually get published. So what advice would you give for me if I wanted to convince people that this was an actual very important step, pre-registering a protocol for this kind of studies?
I would say there's different types of studies, and some of them it's more important to pre-register and some of it's not so important. But like, for example, if you wanted to make an effectiveness claim for a medication or other intervention, in that case, I think it would be very important to state upfront, like, this is how I'm going to study. This is my best way of approaching it. This is where I'm starting, register it. And then as you get into it, you probably will encounter something that surprises you, that's unexpected. And that should be documented, what changed, why it changed, when it changed, and carry on from there. But then you have like that sort of audit trail moving forward from where you started to where you end up. That really, I think, would engender more trust in how you got to the answer as opposed to, in the end, here it is.
That's exactly it. And it's probably very important for this to have regulatory importance and to be taken as actual evidence that has quality. So as a last thought, in your last, you mentioned interdisciplinary collaboration, and I cannot emphasize enough how this is an important topic in this kind of discussions, from data source to interpretation of the results, which is what we want to achieve, something that is transparent. And how do you feel that we are lacking in this department, and what we can do to strengthen this interdisciplinary communication to ensure that transparency is from end to end in this kind of studies?
I think there's a couple different places where we could improve. Like there's moving from the raw data to the research database. There's a lot of transformations that are happening, and the documentation of how you get from raw to research database is often hidden. And you don't it's hard to understand what you're capturing if it's too mapped without understanding of where it came from. And then there's the second step of from research database to analytic data set, all of the transformations and that you do to get to your study variables, those ones and zeros for exposure and covariates. And that sometimes is hidden too without a clearly specified protocol. And then from your analytic data set to your actual summary result, your hazard ratio or whatever, I feel like that tends to be better documented. It's probably like, a couple lines of code, unless it's a really complicated machine learning model. But all of this, like the amount of impact, whatever parameter you pick here, really depends on like the first step of getting from raw data to research database and research database to analytic data set. So we really need that whole pipeline to be clear, and that requires the clinical expertise who is going to tell you to decide how to measure given the research database, as well as the database expertise, and input about how to convert from raw to your research database. And it just takes a lot of people working together, and it takes a lot of effort. But once you get it set up, I think you can build off of that, and it's good infrastructure.
So just to build on what you are saying, can I say that if we over harmonize, we risk having some information and context loss from those transformations?
I think that is a distinct possibility when you're working, especially if you're working with people with data partners where the raw data is very different to begin with. And also the concepts that you map to may not be fine-grained enough. Like one does not suit all purposes. I think I was mentioning like a concept for MI for an outcome, I would define that very differently than a concept for MI for inclusion or a concept for MI for a covariate. And so I would not measure those the same way in my study. But if that's all that's available in my data, then I do not feel comfortable with necessarily using it that way. I would want to go back and create my own algorithm or variable to use appropriately for the different ways that I want to use it.
So thank you very much. If I don't know if there is room for any further questions from the embassy, or if you'd like to make a final remark. I think, yeah, we have, we have. Very good. I will. We need another microphone, possibly.
Yeah. I'll make a question. Okay. So first of all, congratulations. It's always a privilege to hear you speaking about the. I have also concerning the methodologies that we are using to get to the research question. I'm getting more doubts than sometimes more certains about inductive measures or deductive and grounded theory way that we're going to get the question for what you're going to answer. Do you believe that real world evidence and the way that we are going to create the research question needs to be more on the ways that the things that we are founding on the field, on the research, that we are gathering, where we are gathering information until we get to the question, or because the traditional model being very deductive, where we have a question, then we have reframed our purpose of research. It's more old school, and we need to be looking for what real world evidence is creating for us to create a research question and then to develop the investigation.
I'm not sure I completely understood the question, but I think we need both directions. Going just one way doesn't make sense. Like for example, I'm just thinking in a safety setting, when we're trying to do signal detection with machine learning techniques, we often have a first hypothesis-free screening to look for potential areas of concern. And then we follow up on those with more detailed protocolized studies to try and understand with validated algorithms and things like that, is there really a concern? And then you have to take that to another database to see if that can be confirmed. And that's sort of like first sort of screening to see what the data tells us and then following up. And then separately, you might already have from other sources a question that you just want to take to the data and it's already clearly defined and you want to confirm or refute it that way. So I think you do need to be able to go both ways and it could be useful both ways.
Yeah. Second question, can I have no, it's very important because then when we are submitting a study, sometimes they want us to frame very hardly what we are going to research and doesn't give us so much open possibilities when we are going to look for the data. Let's imagine then in a secondary approach that we have to do a retrospective study. We have to frame for the purpose of the variables that we are going to measure. And probably we are missing other variables that explain better that variation of results. What's your perspective on the way that this new methodology of research needs to be adapted to this kind of situation?
You mean as opposed to having all of your variables pre-specified and not being able to look for
Yes.
more things? Well, I guess ideally you would work with your team to come up with things that you think you can measure and are relevant and go through the data to try and create algorithms to measure that. But there's also, if in case you don't think of everything, there's data adaptive approaches to try and identify variables that may be useful to also include in your models if that's relevant. I'm not sure I entirely addressed the question.
Yes, you address. It's just because the traditional way for us doing research and submitting some studies are very guardrail from the possibility of what science needs to go for some closed variables that we are not looking. And if we don't look for that variables, we'll never find it. It's like the trials in drugs.
Yeah.
They only go for approval. But then we stop looking for the data that is producing in real world evidence, and it's very different for when we are comparing two trials. I never found in real world evidence a supposition on the trial. So what are we treating, trial patients or real patients?
Yeah, well, real patients.
Yeah, okay. So I think research needs another development, probably the full phase 4 of the research of the drugs, which is something that we need to be, that the FDA is getting now, okay? Yeah, but thank you.
Hello. Nice having you here. It's a really pleasure. I wanted to make a question more regarding the quality of the data, right? When we go to secondary data, typically there's a challenge on missing data. We got loads of data, right? So huge quantities. But when compared, for instance, of the more, let's call it traditional way, where we had chart review, physicians were entering the data, it was more controlled there, right? Using the secondary data poses a lot of questions there, right? Because how do you think we can enhance more the quality of what we got on the hospital health records? Because we have what we have, right? So what can be done there? What do you think that works better to validate and increase that quality of the analysis that we're then going to be doing?
That's a tough one because it requires a lot of infrastructure to get EHRs to be more populated and a lot of people and doctors buying in as well to record things more clearly. I can say that a lot of the work that we've done has been more with claims data, which does not have some of that information like on labs and stuff that the EHR would have. But what we've been doing is developing algorithms in claims to try and capture that and using the things in EHR as the reference standard. And in that way, trying to get reasonable measures, proxies for it in data that doesn't actually include it. So
it's a bit of working in the beginning, so making the physicians put the data better and working that gets better in the beginning. That's a bit of what
in the beginning, yes.
And then, okay, yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great talk. You develop new strategies and methodologies especially for future clinical trials optimization. What about what we've been published data in clinical trials in the last 20 or 30 years? Do you think it's bad data, or or how can we? Because imagine that you wanted to check the efficacy of chemotherapeutic drugs in all cancers in the last 20 or 30 years. But the thing is that when you look at the trials, there's a lot of gaps in terms of outcomes, because some trials just give overall survival, others do progression-free survival, others are. So there are tons of variables that sometimes are not present in all of the trials. How you could build a model, imagine a machine learning model that could predict this with all of these gaps in the trials for the outcomes.
Oh, strictly using only trial information?
Yeah.
That would be quite challenging. I was thinking more along the lines of, although we would have to have a lot of historical data, of trying to answer those questions with real world data, trying to emulate those trials, see if you can get the same results, and then try and answer with different outcomes or in slightly different populations. Given that you could get the same results for the trial that was conducted, what result would you have in a population where the trial was not conducted with a different outcome or something like that, and try and fill in the gaps that way.
Only comparing it.
Mhm.
Thank you.
May I just do a follow-up on your question, which is, I think you can listen, right? In healthcare providing, but processes are non-stationary. So treatments are always changing throughout time, and the way things are recorded are changing throughout time. So this is something that also impacts on data quality, but also impacts on our ability to keep the interpretability throughout all these changes on a non-stationary process.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you had the most granular and the most complete data set, how would you be able to track and to deal, even from a methodological point of view, with this non-stationary process of data collection that we have in the HR by default? And
I think it's really hard. And I was just thinking of a cancer example where sometimes you have a breakthrough drug, and when it comes through, everybody switches to the new drug. So you can't compare it to the drug that was previously used. So if the time period is short and it's a really complete takeover, you can consider methods like instrumental variable methods or other things like that. But with caveats and assumptions and things like that. So it depends on the data structure, the way things change in clinical practice, a whole lot of things, what methods would be the most appropriate to try and address those questions. But things like that do happen in clinical practice. Yeah,
we have to deal with
you have to deal with it. Yeah.
Can possibly wrap up. Thank you so much for your answers and your contribution. Hope everyone felt this was as valuable as myself, and hope that you also enjoyed the questions. And I don't know if Paulo, you want to close?
Say thank you, everybody. A round of applause for now, please wait for it was outside. So officially, we are starting the L-Data Forum. It is welcoming here on the Medical School Research Center. Thank you.
Asking this because we actually publish on advanced technology, because I work on nanotechnology to develop new drugs, new drug delivery systems. And we did that